Good afternoon. Welcome to the third and final of our Past as Prayers presentations. Voices of Resistance, Advocacy, and Activism, during which we'll be exploring the history of our parish at St. Francis Xavier College Church. My name is Winnie Sullivan, and with my friend and colleague, Lisa Burks, I co-chair the Parish Antiracism team, and have been part of the group that has worked to bring you these presentations. We are delighted that you can be with us this afternoon. Now I'm going to invite Katie Jansen, our Parish Life Coordinator, to open our gathering for the prayer.
Good morning. And because I have the microphone, I'm going to do one more thing too. I think you all know that Winnie and Lisa have been the primary organizers of this event, this three-session event. I don't know if you know how much work they've put in behind the scenes, or how well they are leading our anti-racism work here at College Church. So I just want to acknowledge and thank them for all of the work that they've done. So let's take a minute to quiet ourselves, to remember that God is with us. This is a prayer that was originally written for Black History Month, and I made some changes so that it could be for Black Catholic History Month, which is November. Spirit of abundance, God of grace, Mother of hope, we pause now to remember those stories that are all around us, but so often passed over. Those stories that when told are shared because of what someone is, not who they are. This month, in our church's character, is Black Catholic History Month. Help us to realize that Black Catholic history is all our histories. May the day come when these stories are so wildly taught that no month need be separately divided. We know this day will not come until we as a people make different choices. We pray now for those new choices. Give those full of fear, hope. May we come to know grace so that our hearts will not be hardened to the pain around us. There are so many beautiful stories needing to be told, and we need to get the chance to hear them. Widen our vision so that the history that is shared this month and every month come to be known as our history too. We are most human when we see the humanity in others. Amen.
Amen. Katie. So, as I have for the last two sessions, I'd like just to speak briefly about why we're making such an effort right now to learn about and understand our history and then share that knowledge. As many of you know, we have been engaged actually for almost a year now in a parish racial equity review. And that's a process by which we are scrutinizing every aspect of our parish life. We're assessing where within our policies and practices and offerings systemic racism is yet preserved. And we're acting to dismantle those structures, but replacing them with more equitable ones. Aiding us in this process is the Crossroads Anti-Racism and Training Organization, with whom we've been working since 2018. So the very first activity that Crossroads set for us as we began the review was a history assignment to ground our anti-racism work going forward. Little did we know when we undertook that assignment how it would blossom and grow and how significant it would become in enterprise Our parish is so old, nearly 200 years. Consequently, to understand our parish history, we had to become familiar with the history of the St. Louis Archdiocese, the Jesuit Order, the history of St. Louis University, and our civic history, important events in our city, state, and nation that have formed our context. I invite you to take a look at our historical banners there, and also to pick up a copy of our historical brochure as you read, to gain a better sense of how these aspects of our history interface with one another. It's our hope that you're going to find this presentation not only intellectually engaging, but also emotionally resonant as well. And now I'm going to ask Lisa to introduce what we found to be a very helpful way to frame what the Untitled Chapter is.
Thank you, Winnie. This process of exploring our parish racial history has been a search for and discovery of stories. As human beings, we are wired to engage each other and the world around us through language. We gain information and understand through the narratives we encounter. And we integrate these stories into our way of being, individually and collectively. Stories shape our identities and guide our actions. Through our work with Crossroads, we are learning to examine our personal and our shared stories and to identify the racial narrative that is communicated through them. Educator Dr. Leanne Bell developed a process that helps us to consider how different types of stories can function to maintain or to challenge racial inequities. As you listen to the stories shared today, consider which type each may be and the function that it serves. Bell names 4 types. The type we encounter most often are the stock stories. They present the cultural narrative that is commonly held about a group of people. They reinforce what is acceptable and considered to be normal. Such stories are created by the culturally dominant group and are passed on through the systems and institutions they govern. They function to maintain the racial status quo. There are many other stories that have been left out of the dominant narrative. Those are concealed stories. These are stories familiar to people of color and other members of marginalized communities who have struggled to be fully included in society. They are the stories of those who have been left out of or even harmed by the exclusive telling of the stock stories. There are also stories of resistance, and you will hear many of those today. These stories recall the many people from all racial groups and identities who, in addition to our well-known heroes, resisted oppression and fought against it. These stories of resistance are important because they give us a more complete and accurate picture of our history and provide models of leadership, collaboration, and inspiration. The final type of story is called emerging and transforming. We create these stories in the present moment as we build on what we've learned by studying the stock, concealed, and resistant stories. As we personally connect to these stories, we find our own role in either supporting or challenging injustice through our own everyday actions. Individually and collectively, we can create new stories that interrupt and dismantle the old racist narratives and replace them with new narratives that can redefine our way of being with one another.
So before we introduce today's speakers, we'd like to recognize members of the History Committee who are responsible for researching, curating, and communicating the information you see in the history brochure presented on the banners, in a video, and then shared with you here today. So will members of the History Committee here please stand and be recognized? Mary White, David Worthman, Henry Weber, Kelly Schmidt, Lisa Burks, and Carl Reiner. Father Dan White was also a member of the committee. We want to thank Laura Stanton for her design work that helped to create the brochure and the banners. Many thanks also go out to Laura Winter for managing the efforts and abilities of this group so that it produced the beautiful materials that will help us continue to share these stories. The support of Archivist and Jesuit Archivist has been invaluable to the work of this committee. We thank Kevin Karam for his time and talent that will allow us to make this presentation available through video. In addition, we want to recognize Angela and Sullivan's ongoing support with countless details brings our ideas into groups. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers for today. Ángel Flores-Fontánez was born and raised in Puerto Rico. He's a doctoral student of U.S. history at St. Louis University. In May 2021, he completed his master's in U.S. history and his graduate minor in women's and gender studies at SLU, with his thesis titled, "They Feared No Man, the Desegregation of St. Louis University." Ángel is also the accompaniment coordinator at IFLA, a local immigrant rights organization, and a member of the anti-detention group Migrantes Unidos. He has done immigration work in an Annunciation House in El Paso, Texas, and accompanied women workers in Nicaragua with the Asociación Mercado Juan XXI Tercero, so the Association of John Paul and John III. His writings include multiple articles and a video series for the Jesuit Post about anti-racism. He is passionate about the history of radical movements, anti-racism, decolonization, and the rights of women and the LGBTQI community. John Waide was born and raised in Alton, Illinois. He received his bachelor's degree in history from St. Louis University in 1973 and his master's in history from Duke University the following year. John began his career at St. Louis University in Pius XII Memorial Library as a reference librarian in 1974. He was named University Archivist in 1988 and held that position for nearly 26 years. John also trained at the Modern Archives Institute, sponsored by the National Archives of the United States. In 2014, he retired from the faculty of the university, though he has continued in the part-time position of outreach coordinator for the library. In 2016, he was named Archivist Emeritus. John has researched and written in the role of co-author, Always at the Frontier, a work celebrating the bicentennial of St. Louis University. He has written a brief biography of Father James Vanderbilt, St. Louis University's third president, which appeared in the Dictionary of National Biography, published by Oxford University Press, and the biography of Father Pierre Gabriel Marist in the Dictionary of Missouri Biography, published by the University of Missouri Press. He is a recipient of the Fons Sapiesti Seat of Wisdom Award from the Greater St. Louis chapter of the Catholic Library Association and the Association of St. Louis Area Archivists Achievement Award. Mary White is a longtime member of the Anti-Racism Committee who joined the parish in 2014. A native of Connecticut, Mary received her undergraduate and graduate degrees in biology and mathematics, respectively, from St. Louis University, and a degree in educational administration from Southern Connecticut University. Her career spanned elementary and secondary education, including a 5-year stint as a high school principal in southwestern Pennsylvania. At midlife, Mary switched careers, graduated from the St. Louis University Physician Assistant Program, and practiced inpatient medicine at Jacobi Medical Center in Flores, before returning to the SLU PA program as an assistant professor. She retired in 2018 and is currently a member of the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, the Christian Life Community, and the Bridges program. Lisa Burks and her husband, Michael, have been parishioners at College Church for more than 35 years. In that time, Lisa has served in many different ministries. Currently, she's a member of the Racism and Reconciliation Committee and the co-chair of the Anti-Racism team. To this work, she brings knowledge and experience gained through professional practice as a school counselor and involvement in programs supporting educational equity. She's also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Education and Special Education at Fontánez University. Lisa has developed and facilitated learning experiences for youth and adults designed to increase understanding of systemic racism. She's honored to work with so many others in the church and in the community who share the commitment to racial justice. Lisa.
So our program today will focus on 2 eras. The first, beginning in the 1940s, will explore events related to desegregation within St. Louis University, the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and within the community. In a moment, I will begin by describing a bit of the historical context that will help us to understand some of the conditions that made this time ripe for change. Ángel Flores-Fontánez will present events leading to the desegregation of St. Louis University, sharing findings from his research into the stories behind the headlines familiar to many of us, and identifying lessons we may take from the activism of this time. Next, Mary White will provide us with an historical bridge between the late 1940s and the 1960s, and help us to see how the church and the community were living into the changes of that period. With that time frame in mind, John Waide will tell us about some of the more contemporary acts of resistance and activism at SLU, based on some of his archival research as well as his personal experience. And after some brief concluding remarks, there will be some time for questions of our speakers. While the time limitations of our agenda did not allow for a designated discussion at your tables, as we conclude today, we invite you to continue the conversation with those gathered here and to share what you learned with others outside of this space. Please consider your personal connections to the stories that will be presented. Think about how the courage, the faith, and the commitment of these, our Catholic ancestors, has impacted you and your family. How does your memory and perspective compare to the lives and experience, to their lives and experience of community and church? At your tables, you see some printed timelines, and I hope you've had a chance to kind of look those over as you enjoy lunch. These were created by members of the Parish Equity Review Team as part of our training with Crossroads. And in that module, we explored many stories that are generally left out of the history books. but they convey the lived experience of people of color, including indigenous people, immigrants, and others who are marginalized by the dominant culture. We were tasked with researching and recording these stories on the timeline in order to create a more complete historical picture. So we share them with you today as a background for the information to be presented, and we ask you to put yourself in that picture. Imagine yourself in each era. Where were you or your family at this point in time? How did you feel or respond if you were aware of these events? What was your experience if you were not aware? At your table, you will also see Post-it notes and pens. As you hear the stories told today, make a note of your own experience that resonates with you. Jot down a few lines about the story on the Post-it note and add it to the timeline. We will collect these materials at the end of the session, compile your responses, and share them with the group through email. So please make sure you have signed in and that you write legibly. Through this activity and throughout this exploration of our parish racial history, we can see how people and events are interrelated. As we better understand this history, we're able to see how we have been shaped individually and collectively, whether we realize it or not. And that makes us part of the story. As you have seen from the 3 banners in the brochure, it's clear that we have examined these stories in 3 distinct strands: the civic history of the region and of the United States, the history of the Archdiocese, and the shared history of the Jesuits, the University, and St. Francis Xavier College Church as a parish. Events in each strand are placed in proximity to one another on the timelines, so you can see the relationships and consider how they impact one another. In preparing for today's presentation, we began to visualize a somewhat different model, one in which these events overlap and interconnect. And I found myself looking on the steps of College Church and imagining these events unfolding. As I learned more about the people who resisted the racism that was so overtly present during this time, I asked myself, what was the impact on the parish of College Church? Who were the congregants? What did they know about the experience of those in the community just beyond these walls and the boundaries of the university? How did they seek to impact the community? And we will begin to answer some of these questions today. So, now we'll get started. Today's story opens in the early 1940s, and at this time, St. Louis is a highly segregated community. As one of the destination cities of the Great Migration, St. Louis came to be one of 10 designated as hyper-segregated, meaning that the separation between Black people and white people was so complete, they rarely interacted outside of an employment setting. Racial covenants limited African American residents to specific neighborhoods, one of which was Mill Creek Valley, whose eastern border was just across Grand Avenue from College Church. Employment opportunities for African Americans are few. Even as white St. Louis workers began to benefit from the manufacturing growth of World War II, Black workers encountered a whites-only hiring practice and lower wages. It is important to note that in spite of these barriers, Black St. Louisans used the resources that were available to complete education, to support their community, and to create opportunities for others. As we heard in last month's presentation, the parish of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, established for ministry to Black Catholics, was thriving. With Father William Marcoux as the pastor, it not only is growing in its care for the spiritual, educational, social, and physical needs of its parishioners, it is a center of advocacy for desegregation, particularly within the Catholic Church. It published the Interracial Review and promoted racial equality. Missions and ministries continue to grow through the work of religious orders, such as the Only Sisters of Providence, the Helpers of the Holy Souls, Sisters of St. Joseph of Cronzoret, and others. They ran schools, provided religious instruction, cared for orphans. The parishes of St. Malachy, St. Nicholas, and Visitation were home to some of these ministries. In spite of the encouraging words of Pope Pius XII, who blessed the work of service to the Black community out of a special paternal affection, in St. Louis, John Glennon rejected any proposal for integration. Catholic schools and churches in St. Louis remain segregated. During this time, St. Francis Xavier sponsored an elementary school and a high school that educated white students exclusively. My review of available parish bulletins from this era provided a glimpse into the parish life at St. Francis at that time. In those bulletins, I observed a focus on the sacramental life of congregants. They published, of course, the times priests were available to hear confessions and when Mass was celebrated. In one issue, printed in 1943, I read the list of prayers and devotions required to obtain a plenary indulgence. There were a number of sodalities whose members would volunteer to fill the schedule for adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. There were also indication of dedication to works of charity, exemplified by the St. Vincent de Paul Society among the sodalities. Also, a subcommittee of the Xavier High School Mothers Club, the Red Cross unit, was assembling care packages for the armed forces. And some of the ladies volunteered one afternoon each month to assist the Sisters of the Sodality of St. Peter Claver in their work supporting missions in Africa. There are scant clues about the parish's awareness of or response to a story, now familiar to many of us, of the impassioned sermon by Father Claude Highhouse to the students of St. Louis University, a sermon that precipitated the end of its segregation policies. It certainly made the headlines. But was it ever incorporated into a Sunday sermon? Was it discussed at a sodality meeting? There's still so much more that we want to know about the engagement between College Church and service to the Black community and advocacy by or on behalf of Black Catholics. And we will continue to search for and discover those connections so we can better see how we fit into this story. And now I'm happy for Ángel Flores-Fontánez to share his discoveries in examining this important chapter in our history, particularly St. Louis University.
Thank you. This phrase by Asada Shakur illustrates the one point I would like you to take home with you today. Educational efforts alone cannot by themselves bring social change. Resistance is also required. This was the most important personal lesson that I got from my research. I would like to thank you all for being here and for inviting me to participate. I would like to especially thank those of you who read my thesis. There were thousands of books that you could have read in the libraries of St. Louis. You chose a graduate student thesis full of typos instead. I will take that as a compliment. You might have heard the story of how the United States ended legal segregation. You might have sounded something like this. After a successful campaign in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and other friends from church organized a march in Washington, D.C. There, Martin gave a magnificent speech called I Have a Dream, asking everyone to judge people by their character and not the color of their skin. Sometime after that, most people agreed with Martin, and a couple of laws were passed that finally defeated segregation in the United States. The end. This narrative is what historian Jean Theo Harris calls the national fable of the civil rights movement. In reality, hundreds of activists were injured or killed. 7 out of 10 Americans at the height of the civil rights movement disapproved of King and the movement. Federal laws were constantly disobeyed by massive white resistance all over the country, not just the South. Desegregation only happened because it was forced by the Supreme Court. Sometimes it even required the use of the National Guard and federal marshals. And many of the laws were passed only after violent uprisings happened around the country, like the uprising of Watts, Los Angeles in 1965. Speeches and education were not solely responsible for the changes around the country. SLU also has a fable of integration. The story goes like this. SLU did not admit black students for a while. Suddenly, in 1944, a Jesuit called Claude Hidehouse gave a homily in College Church denouncing segregation. Most Jesuits changed their mind after that, and SLU was integrated. Here's the deal. To start, SLU was not integrated in 1944. Integration, by definition, is a process in which members of diverse racial groups experience equal treatment in a desegregated space. What happened in 44 was the mere desegregation of the admission policies. Black students were admitted on campus. That's it. This change was forced upon the university administrators against their wishes by the public pressure from local press and community members. Also, the effort was led by a group of black Catholic activists and white Jesuit accomplices, who were a few, and who publicly exposed these racist practices of the college's leadership. So watch out when you see things like that. Okay. SLU's fable of integration is inaccurate, but also harmful. It erases the black activists that gave desegregation its momentum and promotes the wrong idea that moral suasion or moral persuasiveness is enough for social change. My objectives today are to magnify the people and methods that effectively challenge segregation in SLU, and to correct the historical appropriation of Jesuit exceptionalism in SLU's desegregation story. On April 17, 1944, Jesuit Patrick Halloran, the president of SLU, wrote a letter to a black high school student called Norman Coffey. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Coffey, SLU has not deemed it wise to change its policy at the present time regarding the admission of Negro students. We do hope that sometime this problem may be solved satisfactorily for all parts concerned." But then, all of a sudden, everything changed just 8 days later. On April 25, 1944, SLU announced that black students would be accepted. By the academic year of 46-47, SLU had 150 black students. In only 2 years, SLU went from having an official segregationist policy to being the leading Jesuit university admitting black students in the US. Then, the next year, the Archdiocese of St. Louis followed suit and opened all Catholic schools to black students. Two questions arise. What happened between the 17th of April and 25th of April in 44 that accelerated these changes? What led the Archdiocese to also desegregate so fast? I will summarize this story for you and argue that the pro-segregation admission policies in SLU and the Archdiocese were defeated by a group of black Catholics, Jesuits, and the new Archbishop through the use of 4 tactics: denunciation in the media, public pressure, enforcing desegregation measures, and finally, enforcing punitive measures against detractors in the Archdiocese. Without these, victory would have not been achieved. The general period of active desegregation efforts in SLU runs about 40 years, and it can be divided into 4 stages. The first one, I call it words without deeds. The second, gradualism and clandestine disobedience. Next, public pressure, and finally, desegregation enforcement, which runs until this day. In the first stage, desegregation remains only as a remote possibility for SLU's administrators, something that echoes through the chambers every now and then. The first known meeting in which the subject was brought up by the Board of Trustees happened in 1911. The meeting's minute reads, "The question of receiving Negroes into the classes of the university was discussed, but action was deferred." This became a pattern in the Board of Trustees meetings that did not change for the next 30 years. Discussed, but deferred. Discussed, but deferred. The second stage, gradualism and clandestine disobedience. The predominant idea among anti-segregation Catholics during this second stage is that equality must be achieved without sacrificing the church's prestige. At this point, they believe that systemic racism in the church is just a matter of ignorance. Therefore, if we educate people, if we talk about it, if we aim at changing hearts and minds, if that is our aim, we will succeed. So acts of resistance at this time are very small and relatively include low risks. They do not include public challenges mostly. One example was when black Catholics from St. Elizabeth, the segregated parish in the Archdiocese, started conspiring with John and William Marcoux, 2 Jesuit brothers that opposed segregation. They published pro-integration publications in their parish called the Chronicle, formed several interracial organizations, etc. Also, members of the Knights of Peter Claver, which are were the black equivalent of the Knights of Columbus, sometimes had secret nocturnal meetings below SLU's cafeteria. In 1931, something interesting happened that you might have never heard before. As part of an event of the Federated Colored Catholics, which again were sort of the NAACP, the Catholic NAACP, they featured a conference in SLU, and Stephen Theobald, one of the few black Catholic priests in the country, gave a homily during that Mass in which he spoke about the closed doors of Catholic universities to black people in the country. This was in 1931. You might have heard of White House, but probably you have never in your life heard of it. Another plan orchestrated by John Marcoux invited a couple of black girls that could pass as white to apply to SLU. The plan was that after having a couple of successful semesters in the university, they would reveal their identities and show the world that prejudices against the intellectual capacities of black people were wrong. The plan failed. Some students refused to deny their racial identities. Others, who pretended to be white, chose to never reveal their true identities. Why? Once they started enjoying the benefits of white privilege. Every now and then, a school within SLU would accept a black student. Like, for example, Henry Schmant in 1935 or Felicia Stevens in 1939. But all of these were exceptions that did not change the bigger policy in the university. They were just schools. Slavery also had exceptions and did not make it better. Then we arrive at the public pressure stage. Protecting the church's prestige is no longer a criteria. A new era of activism began in 1942 with Charles Anderson. Activists understood that to defeat segregation, they would have to denounce their church and not to hold back for worries about this prestige. After being rejected to take graduate courses in October 1942, Anderson, who was a black high school teacher in the city, organized a public protest in front of the university with the help of the NAACP and with coverage by the Chicago Defender. He distributed a pamphlet that read like this: "Are you," speaking to the administrators of SLU, "allying yourself with the devil and Hitler, who would deny me a right to attend your university because I happen to be a Negro? If we cannot afford to correct past wrongs during these terrible times, when can we afford to correct them? Millions of Negroes in this country think of our church as a white man's church, a Jim Crow church. The true Church of Christ belongs to no race or people or language. Being truly Catholic, I wish to see the stigma of racism removed from the American branch of our church. Will you take a definite stand in this matter?" This was 1942. The protest created publicity, and some SLU donors protested against the university for its segregationist policy, leading the Board of Trustees to discuss desegregation again. In their meeting, months after the protest, they once again voted against admitting black students, even after the administrator of the Board of the School of Medicine agreed to accept students. But they did not count with a black lady called Ethel Williams. Williams, a student aspiring to get into SLU, asked John Marcoux, the Jesuit, for backup to get accepted into SLU. At the time, the president of the university consulted 200 white Catholics on whether he should desegregate or not. Although the majority decided in favor of desegregation, Halloran decided to keep the university segregated. For John Marcoux, this was the last straw after 20 years of silently trying to provoke change. He went to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, gave them the confidential notes of the meetings of the Board of Trustees, the consultation documents, Halloran's letters expressing racist ideas, etc. The Post-Dispatch published articles about it, and the controversy expanded from there to the whole country. That's right. Inspired by these events, Hyde House gave his surprise sermon at College Church in February 1944, denouncing racism and inviting students to make a commitment toward the respect of black people's rights. For this public stand, Hyde House was silenced by Halloran while simultaneously receiving praise from outside of the Jesuit community. And here's where the key moment for desegregation happens. After Halloran sends his letter to Catherine denying his admission, the one we already read, Catherine reports to John Marcoux that he was rejected, who will communicate it to Hyde House immediately. Then, Hyde House will write a letter to Halloran, and he will tell him that if the university doesn't change its policy, they will release more confidential correspondence to the press, and they will also suffer from bad publicity even more. Only after this warning, the SLU finally announced admission desegregation on April 25, 1944. And so it was that the public denunciation defeated segregationists at SLU. Now, let's talk about the Archdiocese. One of the reasons why it was so hard to desegregate SLU was that the local archbishop was openly against desegregation, as we've seen. Glennon, the one who led the construction of the big cathedral, was famous among the black community for his racism. In public forums, he argued that following local traditions of Moors was more important than following principles of racial justice, making segregation necessary to avoid trouble in this southern city-style city. And he also shared many of the prejudices of his white contemporaries, especially in private conversations. In 1945, Jane Aileen Kaiser, a black woman of fair skin, tried to get her son admitted in the Catholic school of St. Thomas Parish. Because of race, the request was denied by the pastor. So she went to Glennon to protest. Once he realized she was black, she accused her of trying to fool him and kicked her out of his office, to which she answered with warnings about going to the press. After hearing about Hidehouse and John Marcoux, she asked for their assistance, and they said yes. But because of their continued resistance to their superiors, Hidehouse, John Marcoux, and all other Jesuits directly involved in SLU desegregation were kicked out of the city, leaving Kaiser on her own. Suddenly, Pope Pius XII made Glennon a cardinal in 1946 for unknown reasons. And while making a stop in London, Glennon died. The opportunity to have a new leader in St. Louis arrived. Kaiser then sent a letter to the U.S. Apostolic Delegate requesting to bring Bishop Joseph E. Ritter to St. Louis. Ritter became famous in Indiana for desegregating a diocese. Indeed, Ritter was brought to St. Louis, just as Kaiser asked, and made Archbishop in 46. In 1 year, he ordered all Catholic schools to be forcibly opened to black students. A month after the announcement, several hundred pro-segregation white Catholics from all over the diocese organized, protested, wrote to Catholic authorities, and threatened to sue Ritter. Ritter threatened them back with excommunication. The group dissolved. So, both enforcement of the segregation policy and disciplinary measures against detractors had to be in place for segregation of admissions to be defeated. Now, I believe there are 4 lessons that we can learn from SLU's activists. Number 1, segregationists were politically defeated. I mean politically, not in terms of partisanship, but in terms of within their institution, right? They were not convinced out of the racism. Decades of a strategy based on waiting for superiors to change their hearts and minds did not bring change. Organized resistance did. As we've seen, after desegregation, Halloran, Glennon, and company continued their personal campaigns for segregation. Number 2, segregationists could have done better. They were not simply children of their time, as all of the activists we've seen prove it. But they practiced intentional ignorance. Segregationists ignored most students and donors who favored segregation. Their consultation proved it. They also chose not to trust black people, nor other experts of the subject that they had at their disposal. And a university provides them with an intellectually privileged environment to correct ideas, and they misused it. Let this be today a warning to the church for its close-mindedness on issues of the LGBTQI community. Disobedience is necessary to practice justice.
Yep.
Victory requires SLU activists to adjust their religious understanding of obedience. Following God and the dictates of justice clashed them against the church men in power who prioritize church prestige over justice. And finally, pace must be set by the most evolved practices, not the slowest, most close-minded members. When the most close-minded members dictate the pace of an institution or a movement, that institution and that movement becomes an enforcer of injustice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ángel, for a very informative, provocative presentation. My task today is to bridge the gap in 5 minutes between 1950, or the post-White era, and 1970, the post-Vatican II era. I'm going to attempt to do so by again looking through the lenses of civic activities, what was going on in the Universal Church, and what was going on with the Jesuits, which ultimately impacted our parish. Walter Johnson, in his book, The Broken Part of America, writes the following: the 1947 Comprehensive St. Louis City Plan provided a beginner's guide to a racist city, incising and intensifying existing differences of race and class in the physical form of the built environment. In 1948, the Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer, ended the practice of restrictive real estate covenants. The city of St. Louis reached its highest population of over 880,000 in 1950. This was followed by years of white flight and a suburban housing boom that was spanned by the GI Bill. The GI Bill benefited white Americans. It did not benefit veterans of color, and it fueled the present wealth gap. The Federal Housing Act of 1949 provided money for cleaning up urban slums and replacing them with new public housing. The Pruitt-Igoe Public Housing Project, named for Wendell Pruitt, a black World War II airman, and William Igoe, a white congressman, was planned as 2 segregated complexes comprised of 33 11-story buildings on 65 acres of property. However, the St. Louis attorney, Frankie Muse Freeman, changed that, and by her participation as the lead lawyer in the NAACP case that argued against the city of St. Louis. And in that case, racial segregation in public housing in the city ended in 1955. So Pruitt-Igoe was then integrated. Pruitt-Igoe, you may know, was probably considered one of the greatest messes of housing. And Pruitt-Igoe, which, although funded by the federal government, was the maintenance of Pruitt-Igoe was under the jurisdiction of St. Louis City Housing Authority. So in 1972, demolition of Pruitt-Igoe began. The long plan for demolition of Mill Creek Valley began in 1959. And again, the priority was given to economic development and establishing highways that would connect the city to the county and the western part of the country. By 1965, many of the residences had been demolished. However, not very much had been built. And the Mill Creek Valley area was referred to as Hiroshima Flats. The construction of the arch generated a lot of civic pride in St. Louis. But again, it was not without controversy. And in 1964, the social activists Percy Green and Richard Daley together climbed a construction ladder 120 feet up onto the north leg of the arch, protesting lack of minority contractors hired for the arch project. Subsequently, their efforts were successful. Nationally, the civil rights movement was well underway. We experienced Bloody Sunday in the Selma March in 1964. 2 days later, there was a second march called Turnaround Tuesday. And the marchers from around the country gathered that day, including St. Louisan Sister Antona Ebo, Franciscan Sister of Mary, who garnered media attention as the only Negro religious sister in the march. She remained a strong advocate for civil rights throughout her life. The civil rights, or the 1960s, were rife with civil rights legislation. But I want to shift my focus now to the Universal Church, specifically the decade during the 1960s. In October of 1958, Angelo Roncalli was elected as Pope John XXIII. He was nearly 78 years old. He was not expected to be a dynamic pope. However, less than 3 months later, he announced the convening of the Second Vatican Council. And here is his quote: "I want to throw open the windows of the church so that we can see out and the people can see in." The significance of Vatican Council II is really the aggiornamento, or the updating of the church. And we, the laity, learned that the church is the people of God. Vatican II would have a profound effect on the universal church, the society of Jesus, and more importantly, this parish. Father Pedro Arrupe, a central figure in the renewal of the Jesuits after Vatican Council II, was a man on fire with creative fidelity to the spirit of Ignatius of Loyola, and a man who paid attention to reading the signs of the times. A man of great spiritual depth, Arrupe was committed to justice. His work resulted in the decree from the 32nd General Congregation, titled Our Mission Today, the Service of Faith and the Promotion of Justice, which was passed in 1975. This document had a worldwide impact, most notably on Jesuit education, and perhaps we're all familiar with the notion of men and women for others. But also, this document had an impact on the social ministry activities of this parish which would emerge in the following decades. And just to tie this back to Angel's talk, Father Rupe published a letter to the American Jesuits on the interracial apostolate in 1967, but more significantly for us, he wrote a personal letter of apology to Father Kaipex, and in it he makes the statement, "The Christian justice of your position has never been in doubt. Its timeliness has been authenticated in recent years." Thank you.
I want to thank Ángel for his insightful and challenging remarks, Mary and Lisa as well, and Winnie too. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I have a few thoughts about my background, but that's already been covered. One thing I do want to say is my dear wife, Carol, and I were married upstairs in the college church in 1976. Father Houlihan was a pastor. He was one of the 5 consultants, so I guess I have no chance of doing that. What I want to do today is share some of the hidden, not so well known stories about race, St. Louis youth, and in the college church from the time of Father Houghouse's homily in 1944 to the early part of the 20th century. My wife is passing out something here. I'll get to that in a second. I've been concentrating on the decade of the 60s and the 70s. And as was mentioned earlier, my remarks come from my work in the archives, but also from my personal experience as a student. I'll begin what might seem to be an odd way by reading a quote from nearly 120 years ago, and then sharing with you a personal story from 53 years ago. The quote was written by the famous black scholar W.B. Du Bois in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, and Carol's passing that out now, as well as another quote from Dr. King. We'll get to that at the end. And Du Bois, I'm sure all of you have heard this, Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of color line." And he wrote that almost 120 years ago. But now, I ask you to keep that in mind as we proceed. Now my personal story, it's April 1969, and I was a senior in high school at Marquette Catholic High School in Illinois. And Alton's a small town on the Mississippi River, about 30 miles north of St. Louis, in the college church. I had applied for admission at school for the fall semester. I'd been accepted. I had a scholarship. I was pretty smart in those days, so they gave me a scholarship. I signed my room and board contract. I was going to live in Greasy Hall here. I was looking forward to that. Well, my parents called me, it was April the 28th to be exact, and they said, "Come in here and look at the news, John." Again, this is at home in Alton. And the news, the local TV news said that there had been a student protest at St. Louis U. That was the school I was going to be attending in the fall. And they said that black students had taken over the dean's office on again at St. Louis U. And they demonstrated that, the students were demonstrating that they were upset over what they perceived as St. Louis University's continued failure to make a serious long-term commitments to its own black students, black faculty, and black staff, and to the larger community for that matter. They were especially irritated at what they saw as increased incidents of harassment towards black students by campus security or public safety. Negotiations between the representatives of black students and the administration lasted for several days, and they resulted in the administration's agreement to a set of proposals. And I'm not going to necessarily read through these, but I ask you to look at them. And there's the sorts of things that you would expect from that time period. Let's fast forward then. And then not fast forward that far. Then the following spring, May 1970, protests erupted across the country in response to the U.S. bombings in Cambodia and the killing of 4 students by the Ohio National Guard in Kent State. This happened on May the 4th, and I was a freshman student, a first-year student at SLU at the time. Our campus experienced anti-war protests, including students surrounding what we call Shoto House, now they call it Compass House. They're always changing the names of things around here. It's hard to keep all that straight. In any case, shortly after that, 2 black students were killed, and I think this is a lot of people forget, is that 2 black students were killed by police down at Jackson State College, now Jackson State University in Mississippi. This was on May the 15th. And here at SLU then, another round of black student protests erupted. The students were upset, well, you know, you got concerned, you were so upset and concerned about, because there were class moratoriums during the Vietnam protests after May the 4th, but the black students were saying, well, you know, we raised all these issues a year ago, and very little has been done. Okay. Now we're going to jump forward to August the 14th August the 9th of 2014. It was on that day that, and most of you know the story, Michael Brown, the 18-year-old black man from Ferguson, was shot and killed by Officer Wilson. And this killing sparked weeks of protests, some violent, both here in the St. Louis area and around the country. Then about 2 months later, a young black man, 18 years old, by the name of Von Derek Myers, Jr., was killed in the city of St. Louis by an off-duty city police officer. He was working a second job as security. And sadly, ironically, Von Derek Myers Sr. Is a longtime employee of the university here in the facilities department. In any case, these protests continued primarily around St. Louis, and then they led to a peaceful occupation of the clock tower area here on campus, and I'm sure some of you were aware of that. In any case, after several days of discussions among leadership of Occupy SLU and the university administration, it ended up with the signing of something called the Clock Tower Accords, which is a 13-point agreement committing St. Louis University to strengthen diversity, inclusion, and equity on campus. And the Accords also extended that commitment to the university's neighbors, both here in the city, but particularly to underserved families. Well, and again, I'm sorry you don't have these in front of you, but if you look at these Accords, excuse my English, they ain't that much different than what they talked about back in 1970. So my question is, and to kind of frame the rest of this discussion, it's not to be necessarily critical of the university, although maybe I should be more critical of the university. But I still work for them for another month, and I quit entirely, so maybe I'll say more after that. But to ask, you know, what have you been doing for 50 years here at school? Anyway, we've already talked about Father Heidhouse's homily. I want to put up this slide of numbers. Ironically, until the late 1980s, when the university began publishing an annual compilation of statistics called the Planning Reference Guide, it was also called the University Fact Book. Just finding data on the number of black students here at the university can be quite challenging. And some of these numbers here from 50, 60, and 70, I had to look through the yearbooks and look at pictures to identify what I perceive to be African American and black students. And you can look at the numbers here. But, I mean, the numbers are, I'm not quite sure that those 1.9, 1.6, and 1.3 numbers, they're probably a little bit undercounted. But there never were much more than, at that time, I don't know what you found, but they weren't terribly significant, you know, the number of black students here at the time. And yet we continue to pride ourselves on our outreach, to black students. In any case, I mean, we can talk more about that later. It's fair, the black students were admitted to the university, in echoing what Ángel said, they were enrolled in classes throughout the 60s, the 70s, and beyond. There were really few opportunities for them to be included in social activities of the school in these early years. Based on my own experience as an undergraduate student here at the university from 1969 to 73, my perception was, and I think the numbers bear that out, there were really very few black students at the university. And I remember in virtually all my classes, there were 1 or 2 black students, but not very many. I lived all 4 years in Breezeton Hall, which at the time was 1 of 3 men's dormitories over here on West Pine, the other 2 being Walsh and Clemens Hall. And most of the black men students at the time, they lived in the 2nd floor of Clemens. And we always called that the black floor, and that's some inherent racism in that. But the black students lived there because it was more comfortable. They weren't trying to separate themselves, but it was more comfortable for them to live on that floor. If you examine the university yearbooks from 1960 to the early 70s, the first year, at least that I could see, that a black student, male or female, was in any kind of student leadership position or was actively involved, this kind of bears out what Ángel was saying, in any significant student organization was in 1969 to 70, when a young lady by the name of Shirley Gray was a candidate from Miss St. Louis University, and she lost, unfortunately. There were some black students in chorale, the singing group, and the concert band, but student participation and membership in any student organization, at least from the examination of yearbooks, and again from my personal experience, was pretty minimal. Sadly, even as late as 1967 to 68, I mean, there's in our yearbooks there's blackface, pictures of blackface in certain student activities and student organizations. And again, we're not talking about 1920 or 1930. We're talking about 55, 60 years ago, which is pretty sad. I'm going to move to another story, although, and Mary just talked about this. Not necessarily hidden or unknown, but I think it's a fact that at the university we never talk about it. Our expansion east of Grand during the 1960s did have a significant impact on the St. Louis black community. We don't have time to go into all the details today, but early in the 1960s, the university was able to acquire 22.5 acres of property east of Grand between Lindell and McLean. We don't have time to get into the story of Harriet Frost Fordyce, who was a benefactor of the university. She contributed a little over $1 million to help the university buy this property. Shortly after getting this land, the university constructed several new classroom buildings, Ritter, Monsanto, Shannon Hall, McElwain Hall, Underground Lecture Halls, and others. And in the Student Union building, we call it the Bush Memorial Center. They call it Bush Student Center. You're always changing these names. I can't keep them straight. But in any case, the university, again, the fact that we did develop and improve this property, the positive side of that is it did show the university's commitment to the Midtown, but there certainly was a negative side to that. The property which the university purchased was part of a larger urban renewal, and we just talked about that, to redevelop what was known as the Mill Creek Valley. During the first half of the 20th century, Mill Creek Valley, which spanned some 465 acres and went from 20th Street to Grand and from Olive to Shoto, it became one of the largest African American communities in the country, home to hundreds of businesses, organizations, and there were 5,600 residential buildings and 43 churches in Mill Creek. But by 1960, when SLU had acquired this property, it began to deteriorate due to the redlining policies, which Mary alluded to, and housing segregation. The stock of the housing suffered. Nearly 80% of the houses in the area did not have indoor bathrooms, while half did not have running water. While most of the buildings in Mill Creek were torn down, and we talk about the Hiroshima floods, more than 20,000 black residents were displaced. Although more housing would be built in the area, some of you, I know my wife lived in the Clevetown for a while, and there's a whole story behind that which we don't have time to get into. Most of the residents, the old residents in Mill Creek, they didn't move into the Clevetown or any of the new housing. The displaced residents didn't have the income primarily to move into those areas. And scholars will tell you that the Mill Creek Development Project of which St. Lucia's expansion was another example of federal money being used to discriminate against African Americans and displace them from their community. Now, despite the university's not so great efforts to recruit black students and to include them in the activities, there were a couple of positive stories. And since I'm a big basketball fan, I thought I'd bring this one up. In 1965, a 6'5" basketball player by the name of Calvin Burnett from Davenport, Iowa, became the first black intercollegiate athlete at St. Lucie. He quickly became a starter for the Billington basketball team, and he ended up having an outstanding career. But the point I wanted to make is that that year, the university was invited to participate in the Christmas New Year's holiday basketball tournament called the Sugar Bowl Classic, which is held every year in conjunction with the Sugar Bowl football game down in New Orleans. Tulane University of New Orleans was the host school, and in addition to St. Lucie, the University of Notre Dame, Dayton University, and the University of Kentucky were the 4 teams scheduled to play in the tournament. Well, again, this is in 1956. This is 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education, but the state of Louisiana still prohibited black and white athletes from competing against one another in an athletic competition. Now, the sign of the university's some progress. University leadership decided that they would not play in the game if Cal Burnett was not allowed to play. And in a positive note, both Dayton and Notre Dame said that they would not play. The University of Kentucky didn't say that. Remember Adolph Rupp, those who basketball, Adolph Rupp, the outstanding basketball coach, he was not particularly racially progressive either. They agreed they were going to still play, and what did they end up doing? They found University of Houston, Virginia Tech, and the University of Alabama agreed to substitute and play. So they ended up having a basketball tournament which University of Kentucky won. So I mean, there's a downside to this story as well. We should say that Cal Burnett played basketball here for 3 years. He got his undergraduate degree in 1959. Ended up getting a PhD in social psychology, and he was the president of Coppin State University in Maryland for many years after that. Another positive development, although it took till 1977, is that a young black student, Cecilia Kitty Cummings, was elected to be the president of the Student Government Association. Ironically, it was only till 2022 that the first black male student, Eric Hamilton, became the NSGA president. So I guess in 45 years, we've made some progress, but the ladies were 45 years ahead of us guys here. Turning real briefly here to the college church. We've already heard, how the Jesuits ministered to the needs of black Catholics since the earliest years of the Jesuits' arrival here in Missouri. And we've heard about Father Hidehouse and our Crew brothers being active in that. Let's look at a couple of things that I discovered here in some of my research, and again from my personal experience here. And all of these activities here that we're going to talk about, I got the same slide, I guess, that you had there. But anyway, we didn't plan that. I guess great minds think alike on that. We're all in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and the openness of the Second Vatican Council. As a bit of an aside, I remember going to Mass down here in the lower church and burning I didn't burn my draft cards, but burning draft cards and all this stuff. Right over here, it was pretty cold back then. They don't do that. They don't do that sort of thing anymore. The lower church began in 1966 with a 5 o'clock Sunday Mass. It was called an experiment in meaningful liturgy. By fall of 1969 at 10:15 Sunday morning Mass, now it's 10:30, and then Saturday night, Sunday morning midnight Mass. And that midnight Mass was attended almost exclusively by St. Lucie students, not 100%. Some of them had too much to drink the night before. We won't get into that. The liturgy side tended to be quite serious. were quite important for me. The community and fellowship I developed and experience with the other members of the congregation were very, very important, and in some ways I think have contributed to me remaining Catholic to this day. And also at this time, the introduction of music, the same as Jesuits, was occurring at the same time. Another essential element of lower college church liturgies expressed at that time, being celebrated at that time, was the, we'll be done in 5 minutes, were the anti-war protests. And so my own perception is that, that at least in liturgies, the concern was over the war, not so much about issues of racial injustice. I do want to say, though, as we close here, there were people here at the church involved in efforts to help people in the area who were struggling. I found evidence in 1965, the church conducted a parish census, or not just a parish census, but a census of people who lived in the area. They discovered that, which one would expect, people in the area needed financial and material assistance. And they created something called the VIP, or the Voluntary Improvement Program, and another outreach program which they called the Parish Poverty Program. Parish Poverty Program was really pretty cool for, this long ago. They had guidance classes for parish residents. Nearly 200 St. Lucia students volunteered to help with the program. They had offered adult education classes to prepare for the GED or high school equivalency exams, guidance counseling for employment counseling. Most of these sessions for counseling took place right down here in the lower church. And even residents of the parish, members of the parish, arranged for supervised recreation for the kids in the neighborhood over at the St. Francis Xavier Grade School program. They had established a home visitation program where the parishioner would visit the homes of the needy and the aged. They established an alcoholics outreach, where I understand something similar to that still occurs here in the area. And they developed something called the Neighborhood Betterment Association, which consisted of local lawyers, doctors, and other professional people who need to develop practical approaches to solving poverty programs here in the neighborhood. And these outreach activities continued, I found evidence into the late 70s and I suspect in the 80s. As I began my remarks with a quote from Du Bois, I'm going to end with the quote, and that's what I passed out on the table here, Carol passed out, is a quote from Dr. King's speech at Chapman College out in California in 1961. And I'm not going to read the quote here to you. But King posits three attitudes, and this I think ties in with what Ángel was saying, towards the question of social justice and race relations. And King identifies what he calls an extreme optimist point of view, an extreme pessimist point of view, and a realistic point of view. And King says that you can read the quote there, that the extreme optimist and the extreme optimist says everything's moving in the right direction, we've got these laws passed, all we need to do is just get out of the way and let this continue. And the extreme pessimist says, well, we can't do anything, races are never going to get together, we shouldn't do anything. And King argues, well, you know what, those first two positions basically say the same thing. Let's not do anything, let's just let things go. But King implored his audience back then, and I suggest that we need to do the same thing. King asked that we take a more realistic position, saying, yeah, we have come some distance, but we have a hell of a long way to go, and we need to take action to reach our goal and not just sit idly by and expect things to happen. Thanks very much. I got in within 5 minutes there.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you again to all of our speakers and for all of you being here today to be part of this conversation. We have, over these last few months, had a wonderful opportunity to share some of the triumphs and the trials of our ancestors that help to guide our path forward as we continue our road toward racial justice. And I think we have a little bit of time for some questions and answers if anyone would like to pose a question. And we'll see if our speakers have any answers.
I was wondering if the man, Mr. Cochran, who got the letter that said he could not be admitted, was he admitted and did he graduate and what happened to Mr. Cochran?
Unfortunately, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Oh, good, thank you. Unfortunately, I do not know. As far as I was able to research, I did not find any evidence that he reapplied after the doors was open. I would love to think that he did, just as I would love to think that Charles Anderson did. Unfortunately, the last thing I know from Charles Anderson is that I think it was in 1949, he suffered a heart attack and unfortunately died. So I would hope that Mr. both Cochran and Anderson, as long as many others who for decades tried and couldn't, I hope they did. But that unfortunately will be the subject of further research. But I hope that happens.
Thank you. Good luck in your research.
Thank you.
John, this question is for you.
Thank you.
On the screen, you had the number of minorities in the undergrad, and I wondered if you had any idea what the grad is. I know the university has programs that attract a lot of local educators throughout the local area. Many PhD people are graduates of the Sandwich University Department of Education and Administration. So I'm just curious, do you have any idea?
No, I not from official numbers. And I think it's interesting that in the numbers that I saw in the archives that the university collected, it's hard to, for those early years, 50, 60, 70, it's hard to find that data. Now, in the 80s, I'll mention Father Biandi's name. Biandi started this fact book, which at least you can find numbers in. And then I think the numbers I was showing you, 8%, I think that was probably pretty true, even in the graduate and professional school. But back in those early years, I suspect those numbers that I put up there were a little bit of an undercount, but not considerably.
I think I saw it in some news, I don't know, maybe you can answer this, but in the news that Sloop had some relationship, education worker relationship with Parish Stove. Do you know too much about that? Maybe John does too, from being on campus there. How is that helping with the racial situation at the university?
I do not know all of the efforts that the university is currently having, but I do know that the Center for Global Citizenship has several programs actually trying to push the conversation of diversity and anti-racism within the institution. I know, for example, that Jonathan Smith was also a great figure that contributed to these programs. What I have seen as a positive step forward, honestly, was simply the creation of the African American department. Unfortunately, the creation of the department itself, its evolution from being simply African American studies to actually being a department recognized by the university and supported by funds, it took 2020. It took a long time, right? It took 2020 and the uprisings for the university to actually elevate African American studies to African American department. Unfortunately, as far as I know, this was not because there wasn't a desire or that people and professors and students did not push for it. So unfortunately, there is a pattern. There are many people within the university. I know this, I know some of them, and I would like to think that I am one student within the university that is trying to push as well. There are many people in the university certainly pushing for this, but unfortunately challenges are not over. And we continue to face sometimes professors in classrooms that are culturally insensitive, that have not done their research, and we as students end up unfortunately having to also carry that responsibility into the classroom. Sometimes professors that have the job of pushing diversity and anti-racism within the university do not receive support from administrators as much as they should. It is very hard to share an information, like for example, like I'm doing today, but then not being supported by people who actually have the power to push the right things, the right buttons, and seize the right actions in the university. So I just wanted to mention at least a couple of things that I'm aware of. I do know that the Center for Global Citizenship and the Vice President for Diversity in the university do have several programs that go from scholarships to a week of talks and conferences in the university, etc., to support as much as they can. If you want to hear more from students of color and how they experience SLU today, I encourage you to go to YouTube and look for Black testimonies of Black students within SLU. Those testimonies goes from years ago to very recently, and you could hear the experiences of things that they still experience in SLU, because unfortunately, we are still a very small minority within campus, as we have already seen.
So during the presentation, you divided stages of what was going on to address racism, and there was words without deeds, and then gradualism, and then public pressure. And I was curious how you all kind of see college churches' efforts currently, or SLU's efforts, like if you were to kind of put that in the stage, where would you, if you could put it in the stage, what do you kind of see happening right now?
Can you repeat the very last part of your question, the very last?
Yes. So if you were able to put either the efforts of college church or the efforts of SLU into one of the stages that you mentioned, what signs would you see around that would help to identify what's happening? I hope that makes sense.
Interesting. I think we are not in the public pressure stage yet, unfortunately. The public pressure stage varies with time, right? Because, for example, the SLU Accords was a moment of the take of the clock tower that produced the SLU clock tower Accords was a moment of public pressure that again forced the university into the negotiation table. If you right now get into the internet and go to the article written by the university about what happened and what produced the SLU Accords, there's a sentence that says, this was not forced, this was not pushed, this was what the university and the people in the conversation arrived. But what brought them to the table in the first place? The protest, the week of manifestations, etc., etc., etc. So there has been several moments of public pressure. But I would say, unfortunately, in my opinion, the majority of things remain under the table. It is very hard to bring these things to the public, and unfortunately, I certainly believe that until most Catholics rise and protest against their religious leaders and presidents and leaders of their institutions, most things will not change. I am not a Catholic, and I would like to say to you that one of the greatest things I saw in this research was precisely the fact that all of these things were primarily moved by Catholics. Atheists socialists, people of every sort, we're also pushing these efforts outside of the church. But to move your church, Catholics have to move, and unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet. Most Catholics, I think, are operating, in my opinion, still under how much can we move without damaging the church too much. I would like to propose to you that what pushed the church forward in the sex scandals, what pushed the church to address the sex scandals and stop being secret about it, was the push of Catholics, of angry Catholics, that denounced that and brought it to the press again. Okay. Yes?
I was just curious, I don't know who can answer this question, but since Cardinal Lennon was such an avowed racist, there's Cardinal Lennon Children's Hospital. Has anybody had any idea as to when that hospital opened up to people of color, to children?
Yeah, it opened in 1955.
Thank you.
And under Cardinal Ritter. And from the very opening of the hospital, the statement was made that it was to serve all children.
If I may, I'm going to say it more directly. I think, unfortunately, most people are graduates right now. Most people are graduates. Yes?
This is not a question, it's a comment. You know, it's really good to learn the history and the facts. But, you know, and it's good to have our tables integrated, but the only people that aren't going to do anything are us, the white people, because it's our problem. I mean, those who are protesting can move us, but the only way there's change is if we, like you say, get involved and make it change. And so if there's anything in the future, that's what I would expect like this group to do is, are there ways that I personally can do? Like we heard from Jeff Harrison, he gave specific ways a person, this was last time, a person could do something, at least internally, and then maybe not, and then put it into action. You know, but that's where we need to go. Learning is fine, but it doesn't do anything unless you do something.
Thank you. I agree with that, and that's the hope of this space, that this will produce action. Certainly.
I would just respond to that as Winnie said at the outset, this whole series of talks precipitated and grew out of our parish's action of self-scrutiny. And so raising up, we do want to act, we do want to create change, and also in a way that is not necessarily just pointing somewhere else, within ourselves individually, within our institution collectively, to see how we continue to perpetuate the racism that we've been learning about. And one of those ways has been not to talk about the strength and the activism of many Black leaders within our Catholic faith and within the region. So that is one action. It is learning. It's not the only solution, but that is the process that we're engaged in, to continue to lovingly, because we do love our church and we want to call it to be better, and we want to be part of making it better. So thank you so much for being here today, to keep asking those questions within ourselves and within our community.
I'd like to say a final thank you to our presenters, to Lisa, to Ángel, to Mary, and to John, and to thank you for bringing this history to life for us today. So this presentation concludes our Parish Racial History series, but I'll ask you to look for upcoming events and the ways in which we will be seeking to keep these stories in the foreground as part of the legacy that we all share. Thanks very much.